It's time to explore the world according to Glenn. I'm Kevin Jacobsen. Glenn Close is my favorite actress, and this show is all about exploring the career of one of the finest actors of her generation. Each episode, I'll be joined by a guest as we dive into one of Glenn's movies, TV shows, or stage productions, going chronologically through her career, discussing her performance, and assessing the project itself. And today, we are talking Glenn's haunting performance in the legal drama Reversal of Fortune.
Time nominee Glenn Close, motherfuckers.
My guest today is a gifted writer, director, and producer, Emmy-nominated co-creator of Pose, director of several episodes of television, most recently Dr. Odyssey, sadly canceled. He joined me for multiple episodes of my other podcast, And the Runner-Up Is, for the Best Actor series, covering the lineups of 1979 and 2010. Had a great time with those. Welcome to the show, Steven Canals.
Woo! Thanks, Kevin. It's so great to be here with you.
Yes, always such a joy having you on the show. I absolutely love talking movies and actresses with you. So Here we are again.
Here we are again. Let's do it.
Yes. Well, before we talk Reversal of Fortune, I would love to know your relationship to Glenn Close overall, if you remember when you first saw her or took notice of her, and whether you have a favorite performance of hers.
So my relationship to Glenn Close goes all the way back to the 80s. I very distinctly remember my parents making a decision to go to the movies, and they were going to do a double feature. And one of the movies that they went to see was Fatal Attraction. And I remember them coming home and having a conversation with my uncle, I believe, about the movie. And I was 7 or 8, I was little, but I remember just having a little inkling of like what this movie might be about based on their conversation, and being very like exhilarated and being excited to see it at some point. My parents owned it on VHS, and I remember that was one of the first movies that I snuck into the VCR to watch while like being left to my own devices, so they didn't know that I watched it, but I watched it on my own, and not fully understanding exactly what the movie was about thematically, but still being like really like thrilled by what I was watching. So that was sort of my first introduction to Glenn Close. And then she's just been obviously a presence throughout. I think the next kind of film that I saw with her that was really big and had a presence for me was her performance in 101 Dalmatians. And and then ever since then, particularly as a cinephile, you go back and you revisit, so you see their early work, and she's great. She's just always been around.
Yeah, I'm also just curious, since you're, more industry than some of the guests that I've had on before, if there has been any kind of like, what is the general vibe of Glenn Close? If like, what is kind of the reputation of her within the industry, from your perspective, at least, if you're cognizant of that?
Yeah, well, she was funny enough. So one of my collaborators on Pose, Ryan Murphy, had been working on a project with Glenn. And I think for a number of years, they had been talking about, I think she was on Sunset Boulevard actually when they first connected, and I forget what that project was, but anyway, all that to say, everyone who has been in her orbit that I know has always said that she's really lovely and very grounded, and is just a kind human, and is very funny, and that's great, because truth be told, I'm just to spill a little tea, the reality is that if someone isn't kind, if someone isn't congenial, like, folks will tell you very quickly.
Right. Sure.
Even if, like their front-facing, like public persona comes across really nice. Like there are a couple of people that I can tell you when we're, not
We'll talk. We'll talk
yeah,
offline.
we'll talk
Yeah.
private. We'll offline that. But there's a couple of people who, I'm like, oh, that person seems great. And then you talk to folks and
Sure.
they're like, actually, they're not.
Mm,
But Glenn is one of the people that I've heard from a number of folks. She's really lovely and unaffected,
mm,
which I always appreciate, particularly with someone who has a massive profile like her.
right. That's what I was gonna say. Like, she's been around for 50 years at this point in the business, and she seems, just based from like talk shows and even like just privately on Instagram, like a truly humble person. And she has her family and she lives in Montana, and she just tries to stay grounded, which I think is very healthy. So that's very good to know. I appreciate that. But yes, we are entering the 90s now, a very sort of, I guess you could say, up and down period for Glenn. I am very excited to talk Sunset Boulevard, of course, and 101 Dalmatians, Mars Attacks, lots of fun stuff ahead, plus some films that are maybe a little on the more non-existent side that people don't always look back on with a lot of recognition of what that was. So that will always be fun to examine those. And this, I think, is a very exciting kickoff to our deep dive into Glenn in the 90s. So to get into how she got involved with Reversal of Fortune, first of all, this is an adaptation of the real life, ripped from the headlines case of Klaus von Bülow, who was accused of poisoning his wife, Sunny von Bülow, a socialite. She slipped into a coma. He was initially charged with attempted murder, but he then went about the appeal process, hired attorney Alan Dershowitz as his defense, and his conviction was overturned. So Alan Dershowitz, yes, that Alan Dershowitz, future
Mhm.
defender of such luminaries as O.J. Simpson and Harvey Weinstein and Donald Trump and Jeffrey Epstein. The list goes on and on.
That's the Rogues Gallery. Oof.
Truly. He wrote a book about the case called Reversal of Fortune Inside the Von Bülow Case, and Dershowitz's son, Elon, was working as a driver for the film producer Edward R. Pressman, who quickly scooped up the film rights in 1986. So this was, quite a few years in the making, multiple directors and actors attached. It was originally going to be with Klaus Maria Brandauer, after his Oscar nomination for Out of Africa, but that fell through, and Jeremy Irons eventually signed on to play Klaus. Barbet Schroeder got involved as the director, and then for the role of Sunny von Bülow, couldn't really find anyone else in consideration other than Glenn. She was attached in early 1989, and according to AFI, she secured a $3 million pay or play fee, which is a pretty great deal. It's also worth noting here that Glenn had apparently met the real Klaus von Bülow when she was living in New York, and he was going through his second trial, and she said she was sort of put off by his tendency to hold court at dinner parties, quote unquote. But the film mostly takes place during the appeals process as Klaus hires Alan Dershowitz, played by Ron Silver. And we see a lot of the film from Dershowitz's perspective, and he kind of wavers on whether he is in fact guilty or not. But he soon realizes that Klaus's initial trial had some holes in it, which he's hoping to exploit. But then we also get multiple flashbacks to Klaus and his relationship with Sunny, delving into how she was hypoglycemic and how their relationship was strained. She found out he was having an affair with a younger actress, and she also indulged in many different vices. She had a pill addiction, alcohol, sweets, you name it. And she briefly slipped into a coma one night in 1979, for which Klaus was later charged with being responsible for, accused of injecting her with insulin. And then there was another more impactful incident in 1980 where she was found unconscious with her nightgown hiked up in her bathroom, and that left Sunny in a permanently vegetative state, which she would be in for the rest of her life. So the film goes through the appeals trial as Dershowitz and his law students strategize over how to properly defend their client while also giving us Sunny's perspective, which we hear in voiceover. So I know that was a lot, but there's a lot to discuss with this film. Steven, tell me your initial thoughts on Reversal of Fortune, whether you have any, perspective on the real life case maybe, and what you think of Glenn here.
So I don't remember this case in real life. I do
Mm-hmm.
remember when the film was released because by that point I was already obsessed with the Oscars. So I remember the night that Jeremy Irons won. I remember my dad renting the film, I think from RKO Video. For those folks who are
Mm.
listening, may remember that video store, and watching it. I, truth be told, haven't seen this film since the 90s.
Mm.
I think the last time I saw Reversal of Fortune, I was maybe 18, 19. So it'd been a number of decades. So I was excited to revisit, to dive back in. And, I'm a perpetual rewatcher. I love to revisit and, see what new themes emerge, what are the new and exciting parts of the narrative that maybe I missed the first time that I'd seen it. And obviously I was young the first time or the last time that I watched the film. So was excited to see what would come up for me. I will be very honest with you. I didn't love the movie on this rewatch.
It's okay.
There was a
Speak
lot,
your truth.
yes, there was a lot about the film that did not work for me. And I think that part of it has to do with having completed a degree in screenwriting and now,
Mm.
being a professional writer now in Hollywood, that I have to sometimes remind myself to turn that part of my brain off so that I can just go in and enjoy the ride and not be analyzing. But I found myself doing a lot of analyzing like very early on. So the moment that the film started and we see Sunny in this vegetative state, but we are hearing her voiceover and she's narrating the story, I was like, wait, I'm confused. Like, how do we know that this is what she's thinking and feeling? Like, and so, okay, fine.
Yeah.
I can give myself over to that, right? Suspension of
Hmm.
disbelief. I will be honest, and I'm a little biased. I don't love voiceover in general, right?
Yeah.
It always is very expositional. You're like you're giving us a lot, and it's like we can just like let us move through the story and let us find this information out. Like let us sort of be detectives and uncover things as opposed to just giving it to us. So that in the beginning I didn't love. I think overall the story of Klaus's, fighting to overturn the initial trials findings and working with Alan was interesting. Like I was definitely engaged in that. I wish that there had been more connective tissue scene to scene when it comes to his relationship to Sunny, because that really is what is anchoring the whole narrative, right? Like the reason that he's on trial is because he's being accused of killing her. And so I was like, I want to spend more time in that home. I want to spend more time with them as a couple. The very beginning of the movie, we start with Glenn's voiceover, with Sunny's voiceover, and then she disappears for 40 minutes. And I was like, where is she? And the interesting thing to note about that is that Glenn has top billing in the film.
Yes, she does.
And,
Hmm.
to say that this is a supporting role is being kind. Like, I mean, it is a supporting role. Like, it's a supporting role,
Yeah.
but there just isn't there's a lot of road for her to travel, you know? So I think that all of those things stood out for me as issues on the page, that I would have wanted to finesse overall, like if I was part of the project. I think with
Hmm.
all of that said, Glenn is a master at what she does. She's just such a great actor, and her performances always feel really lived in. And I think if anyone ever questioned the quality of a Glenn Close performance or questioned her as a performer, this actually would be probably one of the films that I would tell them to visit, because there's so many challenges for her and she managed to move through them in, I thought, a really beautiful way. The reality is that you still feel, or I should say I felt, a lot of empathy for Sunny as a character. And I think with the few scenes that she has where she's allowed to give us insight into who Sunny is, she knocks it out of the park.
Yeah.
And we can certainly talk about what those scenes are, but I think that she really lays the groundwork for who this woman is, despite the fact that sometimes there are, 10, 15, 20 minutes between scenes, and so I appreciated that, she clearly came in very prepared and managed to still create and craft what felt like a really complex human, despite the fact that she doesn't take up a ton of real estate in the story.
Yeah. I will say to that point, I do find when I'm watching the film, it does feel like she is kind of on a sort of like a parallel, like a different journey compared to what the rest of the film is. And I think isolated from that, she is absolutely, I think, delivering one of her better performances that, obviously she has 8 Oscar nominations. This would be one that I would also maybe consider as worthy of that as well. But I will say something I was not expecting to say on this rewatch, which is that this is probably the most I have appreciated this movie. It's not a film that's particularly inviting or warm by any means. There is an intentional sort of distance and an iciness that I suppose feels intentional with the subject matter and the focus of this very enigmatic figure in Klaus von Bülow. And there are certain procedural elements to this that may not be the most engaging for some people, kind of like standard courtroom drama business. But I think I sort of locked in here on this watch on what Schroeder and the writer Nicholas Kazan are trying to say with the film, which is the idea of like perception and how these kinds of true crime stories can feel sort of black and white with a clear hero and villain, perpetrator and victim, or, aggressor and innocent person. But there is some ambiguity more often than not of these kinds of cases where even though Klaus is such a menacing, almost creepy figure, and he has this sick sense of humor, that doesn't necessarily confirm guilt. That there is a due process, and it's not even just two sides to every story, but it's like there are people around Klaus and Sunny who also have their own story to tell too. Does it always delve deeply into that? Maybe not, but I think the film does do also a solid job of touching upon the privilege that Klaus has in being able to afford all of this, being able to afford an attorney like Dershowitz and bankroll a whole team to help defend him, and how those resources aren't always given to the lower class, obviously, to, minorities and black and brown people. And as we see with Dershowitz's other case that's touched on in the film, where he's defending these two brothers who are black and are of a lower class and they're on death row, and Dershowitz is able to convince Klaus to fund that case too, but that's such a rarity. And I think even though the film doesn't really underline those things very much, I do think there is some commentary there that I did latch onto on this watch.
Yeah, well, to your point, I think one of the things that came through for me is, and again, this is more thinking about less as a just consumer of the content, but more so as like a creator, which is, and I'm sure you've seen this, that there's a Klaus von Bülow limited series in the works at Apple.
Yeah,
And watching the film, that kept coming through for me. I'm like, oh, this story feels ripe for being adapted into a, 8 to 10 episode limited series, because there's so
100%.
many perspectives and other people who have an opinion about what happened here that I would love to explore. And having more real estate would mean that we could spend a little more time with Sunny. Because I was really curious, like, who is she, or who was she before she met Klaus, and I wanted them to dig in a bit more. And I understand that, in the framework of a 2 hour film, you can't do all of that digging. But I think that, to your point, the exploration of Alan at the start and who he is and who he's fighting for, and then taking on this case, I thought was really, really interesting. And I was excited to explore and see. And I think that might be another area, to be honest, that I think I wish that they had dug in a bit more in the feature,
Yeah.
which is Alan's feeling about what was happening. Because the interesting thing is, and again, this is, I appreciated this about the film, and at the same time, I have a critique of it, which is most of Alan's scenes connected to the case are with other people, right? So he's with all of his students, he's working with the Annabella Sciorra character, he's talking to his son. And with Klaus, we spend either time in these flashbacks where we're, being given insight into his relationship with Sunny, or he's spending time with Alan, or Alan and the woman that he's now seeing. And so we don't spend a significant amount of time with either character alone. And I think for me, I wanted a little more insight. Like I just wanted to get a sense of like their interiority and like how they were feeling about what's happening. Like here's the thing, we have the luxury of now knowing where Alan's life has taken him, right? So we know
Yeah.
that several years after this case, he's going to be working with OJ Simpson, right? So for me, I was thinking like in terms of just, are there any complications for you morally and ethically around taking this case on? And I think I wanted to feel some of that tension in the story.
Yeah.
And maybe there isn't any, but it's interesting because they position him as being someone who very much is like, I'm just thinking about the law and what's right and what's wrong. But they've created a character in Klaus who we're supposed to read as maybe not completely, I won't go as far as to say villain, but certainly as antagonist, right? And so if he's the antagonist, then for me, I'm just making an assumption as a viewer, then Alan, I guess, has to be the hero. He has to be our protagonist. And yet it's still gray, which I love that complication. I think that's really interesting, and exciting to watch, but I don't feel like they dug all the way in on his character, so they
Yeah.
gave us like little glimpses into what makes him interesting and then sort of left it on the table.
Right. It is definitely touched upon throughout, and that he has this kind of argument with Felicity Huffman, an early Felicity Huffman performance here as one of her law students, one
Which
of his
are we
law
going to talk
students.
about that? I mean,
We'll get into that, but to speak to your kind of point there, he's kind of arguing the ethics of all this, and then by the end he's also telling Klaus, like, legally, you've won your case, morally you're on your own. That's kind of where the film ends for Alan. But yes, I do definitely wish, because that does feel like the kernel here of something you could really explore, is that tension that Alan is feeling.
well, and
um
the script made a very, or I should say, like Barbet and Nicholas made a very intentional choice here where they're not gonna handhold, which I also appreciate,
yeah.
right? So they really leave it up to you as a viewer to make a decision. Did he do it? Did he not do it? Right? And again, while I appreciate that, I think generally I love that ambiguity. So I will say that's great. But there was a part of me that wanted them to just plant a flag in making a decision about who he is, because I think that would have made it clearer for me as a viewer as to where Alan stands, because he sort of is coming in as you pointed out, listen, like I'm just here to deal with the law, right? And
Right.
it feels like you were not given a fair shake. And so I'm here to kind of help defend you on that point. And yet at the same time, it's like, but how do you then separate the humanity of what's happening, which is that there is a woman who is currently in a vegetative state. There are children who do not have access to their mother anymore, right? And so and the thing again, what I love about the film is that you get to make a decision about whether or not you think he's which I will just say very plainly and clearly, like I think he's responsible. And while he may not have been the person who injected insulin in her, right, or gave her 73 aspirin tablets and told her to swallow them, I think that by proxy he's responsible because he lived with her. That was his wife. He had, access to her. He saw what she was dealing with emotionally, and there was no intervention, right? And
Yeah.
so, again, legally, maybe people could make an argument for you not being responsible, which is what Alan did, but morally and ethically, aren't you responsible? And again, I think all of that's interesting, but I wanted there to be more of an investigation, and this is specific to Alan's character. I wanted that the film to dig deeper into how he's making that decision for himself to separate the two, because that kind of lingered for me, which is like, you don't completely trust this guy. You think that there's a possibility that maybe he could, maybe he didn't, and yet somehow you're still taking his money, right? And so I wanted the
Right.
film to sort of put a spotlight on Alan as well to say, it's easy for you to point the finger and look at what he did, but aren't you also morally corrupt? Like, isn't there a question there around you and your own ethics? And I feel like we never really got that, you know?
Right. Right. Like, it is more told than shown, I would say, just whenever it is brought up. But yes, and I almost wonder if, not to, let the movie off the hook, but I do wonder if it was made today, if there would be more of that exploration that you're talking about, of that moral ambiguity within our protagonist than it would have been in 1990.
We'll
You
see
know,
when that limited series is
we'll
produced.
see. Yes. But I do want to talk about the decision to give Sunny a voice as well, because I think it's interesting the sense that you think about these true crime stories that have been produced over the past few decades, and some of them do delve into the victims' lives. Not always. Sometimes it feels that there is a little bit of dehumanizing going on to a certain degree, and sort of these people are just defined by their tragedy. But I think through Glenn's narration, honestly, even though I don't love narration all that much either, I do think she breathes a lot of life into Sunny and does show her to be a complex person and a thoughtful person who knew much more than she was perhaps letting on. And yes, we can talk about the ethics here too of like even giving her voice and assuming her thoughts, like you mentioned earlier. But, you think of how easy it would be to just limit her involvement in the story to just those flashback scenes at most. But, we come into the story through her narration. She does set the table. Her voice is present in these spots throughout the film, and she closes the film. I do find it to be, for me at least, an effective device in just showing the complexity of the story and how she maybe wasn't the perfect victim, quote unquote, that she was a human being who was deeply unhappy with her life. And I think through Glenn's performance, she absolutely shows that in her body language, in the way she speaks, in her icy sort of chemistry with Jeremy Irons. I think all of that works.
Yeah, I think to your point, as I noted, I generally don't love voiceover. There are very few times where it's used and I feel like it's effective or I enjoy it. That said, what worked for me about the voiceover in this film is that it's the only insight that we get into who Sunny really is. Because the reality is that Klaus is an unreliable narrator, and the
Totally.
only time that we're learning anything about Sunny is through him, right? And so for me, there was always this question of like, is that really her? Like or is that just his perception of who she is? And at least through the voiceover, you get to hear it directly from her, so we have more insight into who the woman is.
Yeah, and I find that in her vocal delivery, even, she has this sort of wry, almost playfulness at times in a very dark humor way as she narrates, talking about her relationship with Klaus and talking about these incidents. And just the way she kind of does a turn of phrase is so compelling, I find, where she's like, for example, whether I was asleep or in a coma later was a subject of dispute. Um, there is just like this lingering thing that you're like, there's just something for me that's very engaging in the way that she draws you in. Like she's almost perhaps delighting in the idea of Klaus getting what's coming to him. There is also a quality to it where I think of Brenda Strong in Desperate Housewives many years later, who
Mhm.
is someone who really had that sort of knowing irony in her narration on that show that I always found very engaging. So that's just,
That's a good reference. That's really good. Yeah, I loved Glenn's overall, I really loved her performance here. I think the voiceover, it was clear to me that she was having fun.
yes.
And that stood out for me. I think the other thing, and this goes back to what I was saying to you earlier around, if folks are being introduced to Glenn for the first time or having a conversation about her skills, why this is a film that I would still point out to folks, despite the fact that she doesn't take up as much space in it as some of her more iconic films and roles, is that when we think of acting, we always think about what a person is doing on camera, what we can see. And I think, we know that acting is so much more, right? It's this
Mhm.
beautiful amalgamation of a lot of different things, right? It's not just about physical presence, but it's also about voice. And so all that to say here, she's really giving a masterclass in that, right? It's like just pay attention to the cadence and the rhythm of her voice and what syllables she's choosing to emphasize. And as you pointed out, there's a wryness there, but she's just she's chewing it up, and I love it. I love that she's just always willing to go there as an actor, which is one of the things I really appreciate about her.
Right.
And those scenes in particular, because there's so many ways, and I'm very curious, like how many takes she did of all of her voiceover, and like what are the different levels. Obviously, what we have in the film is where they landed. Because if you just take what she's saying at surface level, particularly because of where the character is, there certainly is a version where it's much more dour. And
Mm,
here she sounds like she's in the know, right?
right.
There's a
Exactly.
vibrancy to what she's saying, but also like a deep awareness that I really appreciated about it. And it forces you to lean in, which I think just in thinking about her performance, because of the strength of it, it's one of the reasons why I missed her so much when she wasn't on screen.
I agree. She does bring a vitality to it that I do respect that the filmmakers, allowed that perspective. It is interesting though. She said in an interview she wasn't allowed to even talk to anyone who knew the real Sunny von Bülow. I don't know
Hmm,
exactly what she means by wasn't allowed to, but she also says, I feel that I would have given a better performance if I had.
interesting.
Yeah, I don't know. She did kind of have to craft this a little bit sort of out of whole cloth in a way, so it still works. And I do think also her chemistry with Jeremy Irons, like I mentioned earlier, they're both such smart actors and they have that upper class elusive quality that they can do so well. And I do think they are pretty evenly matched here. Also worth mentioning that they had previously worked together on Broadway in the play The Real Thing, for which they both won Tonys in 1984. So they absolutely knew each other, very well. I also read in that interview, she said, I remember telling Jeremy Irons he would be an absolute idiot if he didn't do this movie. So there you go. And now he has an Oscar.
She was right.
Yes. Do we want to talk a little bit about Jeremy's performance to speak to that note? Because he certainly has his own wry turns of phrases that he's really kind of delighting in, the delectable kind of like wickedness of his character. Obviously, one line that I had to write down is, we are each the keepers of our own souls, Alan. Those kinds of lines. He really is just like, the way he just wraps his mouth around those kinds of phrases. It's perfect.
Yeah, whenever I think of Jeremy Irons, I always think of Scar.
Same. That was my introduction to him.
I always think of
Yes.
Scar in The Lion King.
Mm-hmm.
A monkey's uncle. He's great. Overall, I think this was a good performance. If at any point you decide to do a deep dive into the best actor category, yeah, it would be really interesting to kind of dissect the other performances that he was nominated against. I didn't do a ton of research prior to our conversation around like what else was like aside from the five nominees in his category for Best Actor that year at the Oscars. What were the other films or performances that people were talking about? But after having rewatched this film, I was like, wow, I'm really surprised that this is the performance that was able to like, break through because it's a pretty quiet performance. Like it
Yeah.
doesn't give him a lot to do, like it's not overly bombastic. It's not what you would typically see in the best actor category. Um,
Mm-hmm.
it's surprisingly subtle.
Yeah.
You Um,
Even though
and
the vocal tendencies, like I said, do have that, theatrical quality, obviously.
absolutely, absolutely. And he's obviously like having a good time. Like it's clear to me as in the way that we were just talking about that with Glenn, like he's having a really great time playing this character. It's like it feels like delicious is the word that kept coming to
Right.
mind. But he doesn't have an obvious like Oscar clip. Like there isn't
Yeah.
like any one particular scene where you're like like we're seeing him really upset or really angry or very big. It's like, he stays pretty level throughout the entirety of the film,
Mm-hmm.
which is really interesting. But I think the challenge for him was to play that ambiguity, right? And for us to, I don't want to go as far to say to fall in love with him, but we had to at least kind of sort of like him, so that we can go on the journey and have the same questions that Alan and the rest of the team have. And in that case, like he knocks that out of the park. You're
Yeah.
constantly from scene to scene kind of questioning whether like there were a couple of moments for me where I had to remind myself. I was like, wait, no, we're supposed to think that he did it. Because there are moments in scenes. There's a scene with it's towards the end of the film where he's talking to Alan and Christine Baranski's in the scene as well. And I don't remember exactly what the question is, but there was this ask around, what they're going to present when they get to court. And I was sort of taken by the way that he plays the scene because there is a genuine earnestness in that moment that you really haven't seen from Klaus in any other scene up to that point. And I was struck by that because that for me felt like just a little glimpse into, oh, maybe he actually wasn't responsible for this. While
Mm.
most of the film throughout, I was like, he killed her. So that I thought was really interesting. And I'm sure it was really challenging for him to constantly have to play, both sides. I'm actually really curious if in Barbet's direction what he and Jeremy decided, like did they make a definitive decision on where they thought it landed? Because again, like any one of Klaus's scenes could be played in multiple ways.
Yeah, but I think he plays it at the perfect register throughout, and he does have that, verging into more earnestness in the flashback scenes at times with Sunny, and how we're kind of exploring the de-evolution of their relationship and those conversations where he's kind of suggesting, no, I don't want to divorce you. And there's a bit of that, like, quiet, not desperation, but just kind of acquiescing to whatever it is that she wants, that I found interesting. And I do think, before we move forward in the story, go back to the Felicity Huffman part, because it's so funny when she shows up as one of the law students of Dershowitz. And she just raises her hand and she's like, this is bullshit. Why help guilty people get off? He was convicted. And she has that kind of, I mean, speaking of Desperate Housewives, she does have that sort of like energy that is very lively. But I do love that conversation that they do have where they're going back and forth, and he's making some pretty compelling points about how the initial case was kind of flawed, and family hired a private investigator to do this stuff behind the scenes, and the judge made mistakes, and that it wasn't truly a fair trial, and how, yes, this guy does seem like a rich sleaze and all that, but it could be a poor person next who doesn't have Klaus's resources, who could get screwed over in this manner too. And Dershowitz is kind of looking to actually do the due diligence and see that justice is actually served the right way. And, if that means that they go through with it and Klaus is still found guilty, well, I think ultimately he's kind of fine with it because the law is above all else. So yeah, I do like all of those scenes with the law students. There's definitely a liveliness to that you kind of feel like you're in the room with them.
Yeah, no, I agree. I enjoyed those scenes as well, and I that scene with Felicity Huffman's character, I think, is Minnie, especially because it really sets up for us the journey that we are going to go on with this team, which is to constantly be questioning everything, which I
Yeah.
really appreciate. And I think to that end is one of the reasons why I wish that we had gotten more perspectives in real time about the relationship. Like, as opposed to only seeing Sunny through Klaus's recollections, I would have loved to have gotten to know her through other people's recollections. So, we know that they lived in the house with their son and daughter. It's like I would have loved to have seen the kids talk about their mom and how they interacted with her and what their understanding
Totally.
and perception and view of her was. I think we just needed more. We needed more perspectives because, again, in terms of the way that the film is set up, I came into it thinking, okay, well, Klaus is supposed to be our villain or our antagonist in the story, so there was always a question mark for me anytime he started talking about their relationship, and I wasn't sure if I could trust it. And that's certainly one way to tell the story, but I think as a result, outside of, as we've already discussed, those voiceovers, I was never quite sure. I'm like, but is that really who Sunny is, or is that just who you saw her to be? So anyway,
Yeah.
but I really love all the scenes with Alan's students. I think that
Hmm.
they were all plucky and energetic and, were in many ways serving as the audience's surrogate, right? So they were always kind of
Totally.
asking the same questions that we as an audience had, which I appreciated.
Yeah, a lot of great back and forth dialogue where you're definitely seeing both perspectives being argued.
And to the credit of the script, it never feels exposition-y.
Yes. I do love the scene also where Klaus meets the team and he kind of breaks the ice with some truly awful jokes, being like, what do you get a wife who has everything? An injection of insulin. And again, it's that like slimy sort of almost even like an arrogance of like getting away with it that just runs a chill up your spine, I find. And we get some insight into her overdosing on aspirin. And I think, in those flashback scenes, Glenn really performs the heaviness and the tenseness of how Sunny was so physically unwell, like the brittleness there that she could really only fix in her mind through these substances. It's like anything else. Living sober is just too painful for her. And living with Klaus, knowing he's had an affair, which is like, as she says, kind of falls outside of their arrangement, which is that like call girls are okay, but women within their circles are off limits. The tension of that scene, I think, is so deliberately uncomfortable, and she just looks completely miserable, and she's restraining her emotions so much that I find it to be really, really fine work from her. Just that's always the thing that a lot of actors even talk about, is that ability to restrain, and like you're feeling the tension of they want to say something, but there's just so much going on inside of them that it's difficult, and just that tension there I always love.
Yeah.
And she's
He
a
doesn't
master of
have,
that.
I will say that Jeremy Irons doesn't get as much fun work in his scenes with Glenn as
Yeah.
he does in the present day narrative.
Hmm.
And yet, I think that some of his best work in the film are in his scenes with Glenn.
Yeah.
So for me, one of the most beautiful scenes in the film is in the hospital,
Hmm.
uh, when she says to him, can't you ever leave me alone? And then
Mm.
at the very end of the scene, she asks this question, which for me, I was like, oh, like just it breaks your heart, but also it gives you so much insight into her mental state when she asks rhetorically aloud, what am I going to do with myself?
Yeah.
And it's heartbreaking, but it's like those moments where you're seeing him, because I do think in those moments, and part of it I think is the beauty of Jeremy Irons' performance, is that I think there is a place where he really did love her.
Yeah.
And there are multiple ways to read their relationship in this film. No one's going to actually know what the reality of it is other than the two of them. Um,
Hmm.
but but for me, watching the film and watching this version of them, there is a part of me that reads it as there was love at one time. And I think that deep down inside, he really does want her to get better and is exhausted by whatever this journey has been. And at this point, has kind of washed his hands of her, which isn't
Hmm.
fair, to either one of them. It especially isn't fair to her. And you feel that play out in these scenes with them. And so I think his emotional range, I think, is on full display in those scenes when they're together.
Yeah, and I love that sequence where she's narrating about how, whenever anyone thinks of the name Sunny von Bülow, they think coma, that she's no longer really a person with a past, and how, she loved her children and once loved Klaus, and that there's a greater context to her story than just what happened to her in this situation, which again, I do think is a pretty, I would say, ahead of its time depiction of a crime victim story, which can so often be overlooked in favor of just focusing on the murderer or whoever committed the crime. But yeah, as we see, she had this very charming sort of courtship with Klaus, but then it devolved, and then she kind of concludes by wondering, like, is my husband the devil? And all this legal activity, is it in Satan's service?
Yeah. Another scene for me that also I think she's great in, they're both great in it, but I think she's really great in it. And actually, it was this scene that I thought, oh, if she was gonna take this performance to the Oscars, like this is her clip, this is her moment, is the scene
Hmm.
where she says, "I don't want this." And she's telling him like I didn't marry you for this. Like I'm someone who has all this money, and she like forces him like I want you to be a man.
Yep.
The other line that to me just like cuts right to the heart of the matter is I already have a butler. I was like, whew. Like
Oof. Yeah.
she's like, we're gonna go there and I'm gonna tell you how I feel. But she's magnificent in that scene. But that's
Yep.
another scene that's like really powerful and really gives you a lot of insight. And that scene in particular, this may seem like a strange comparison, but made me think about the Virginia Woolf train scene with Nicole Kidman in The Hours, right?
Wow.
Which similarly, and the connect for me between the two characters was that these are two women who are struggling with their mental health and are in this situation where they feel stuck. And in many ways, I think the only way out is to self-harm.
Yeah.
And the one thing that they are really truly fighting for is agency.
Hmm.
Like, this is my life, this is my body. Let me do what I want to do. Step away. And again, to go back to what we were discussing in terms of how to read the movie and how to read their relationship and Klaus as a character, there is this question of his being complicit, but also what is your obligation when the person you're with is literally telling you, leave me alone? And so
Yeah.
it's very complex and
Hmm.
uh, that scene in particular I thought was arguably the most effective in terms of giving me insight and understanding into their relationship. And again, a scene where they both just knocked it out of the park.
Right. And there's the tragedy of she's all at the same time wanting to be left alone, but also wanting him to understand where she's coming from, much like the scene in The Hours where she's talking to Leonard. Yeah, so great comparison there. And then even the lead up to that scene where she's just sitting there in sunglasses at the dinner table, smoking and eating this ice cream sundae. That I think just non verbally, she's communicating where she is at emotionally. That's actually what Glenn said is the scene that made her want to do the movie because, as she said, she was basically killing herself in front of everybody and no words. It was pretty fabulous. And I have to agree. It's,
Well, this is something we haven't touched on, but that scene in particular, I think, is a beautiful segue into talking about this part of her performance, which is that without being obvious, it's a very physical performance.
very.
It doesn't
Mm-hmm.
call attention to itself at all, right? There are these
Mm-hmm.
moments where she's, a little kind of in a drug haze, a little like maybe she's on booze, you're not quite sure, but everything is subtle. It was I think it's maybe an hour and some change into the film, hour and almost an hour and a half, where you finally have Klaus acknowledge that she had fallen and broken her hip. But prior to that, there were a couple of moments where you see her walking, and I was like, I think she has a little bit of a limp. It was
Yep.
so ever so slight. And then he talks about her broken hip, and you're like, ah, there it is. That's
There it
why.
is.
But again, love that she had that happening and she didn't call a ton of attention to it, right? And I think
Right.
that she is just she made very specific and subtle choices in terms of her mannerisms and how to move. And I love that we got the scenes where in her first marriage where she was younger and much more vibrant and alive because it gave us something to juxtapose against when it comes to who Sunny becomes in her marriage with Klaus. And it was great to see her, and that was the other thing that stood out for me in those scenes is that her eyes seemed so much more alive and alert, and they're much more open and bright in a way that they don't look at all in her scenes with Klaus. And again, so it's like those really subtle things that if you pay attention to it, you'll see it, but she's not calling attention to it, which I thought was pretty brilliant.
Yes, there was absolutely intention in every gesture without it feeling too ostentatious, like you're kind of mentioning, which may be, to speak cynically, why she was not nominated for an Oscar. Just saying. Sometimes there's just like an obviousness and like calling attention to yourself that Oscar voters tend to like. Broad
Also,
statement, but
let me ask you this though, as the resident Glenn expert and knowing that she's your favorite actress, who in that supporting actress line, well, before I even go there, would you have campaigned her if you were running the studio? Are you campaigning her supporting or lead?
Supporting.
And
Even though
then
she's first build, I know she's first build, but come on.
no, I think that's the right category for her here.
Yeah.
And then who are you then knocking out in who was nominated to slot her in?
Probably Mary McDonnell in Dances with Wolves. I think she is very good in that movie, but I could do without the nomination there. So yes, I would nominate Glenn. I don't know about you, but we could talk about it later even if you want, if we get into the release of the film. But yes, she would have a ninth nomination in my book. But anyway, yeah, I think it's a really great performance. Like I said, that she does have this like parallel track that she's going on with the rest of the movie that I do find, just if you just isolate her scenes just as a short film, I think it would be probably pretty harrowing, first of all, but you can see the work that she's putting in, even though she didn't even have access to Sunny herself or talked about her with friends or anything. All she had was the script and what she knew of the case. But I do think, as she has done with people like Alex Forrest and the Marquise de Merteuil and all these other characters she's played up to that point, she really studied as much as she could and wrapped her mind around the right approach for this and made a complex person out of it. So,
Yeah, I
you know,
agree. This performance for me is a really good representation of what the supporting categories were created for.
there you go. Exactly. Yes. And as she says at the end, when you get to where I am, you will know the rest, which is a very tantalizing way of leaving us in this space where, we still don't know by the end of the film exactly what happened, because people don't know other than Sonny and I guess Klaus as well. And he's not going to say anything, obviously, to that effect other than to maintain his innocence. But I do like the inclusion of the title card of saying that the Johnson brothers remain on death row,
Mhm.
juxtaposed with Klaus then walking the street freely and joking with a cashier about wanting a vial of insulin and being like, just kidding. I
It's
think
a
it's an effective
very
ending.
sobering ending.
Yeah. Leaves you a lot to chew on as you're walking out of the theater in 1990. So, did you have any other ancillary points that you wanted to make? There's, again, like, there's so much going on with this film and we can only really explore so much, but
I think, oh, no, I think we talked about it all. I think, yeah, the film, as I said at the beginning, I think is just a really great reminder of all the things that she's great at.
yeah. Agreed. Yeah. I think visually, maybe it's not the most striking film necessarily, because it is a lot of just like interiors and just like hanging out in these small rooms with law students for most of it. But
It feels a little dated. It feels a little dated, but
yeah,
we'll
yeah,
forgive
yeah.
it.
Oh, also speak to that. Just a random detail I didn't even notice before on this until this watch is the fact that they play basketball and they have an insulin needle or something on the back, like on their like shirts, and then another one says like black bag,
Yeah, I was gonna
and it
say that
just
was also the bag t-shirt, which was
yes, which I think to me is like okay, but I think is a slight reminder, I think, in that moment of how sometimes when you do get involved in these cases, same thing with people in the medical field, there can be a little bit of desensitizing at times, that you kind of need that slight emotional separation at times, or else you'll just live with it and it'll be too much. So maybe there was some slight commentary on that for that detail. To get to the release of the film, Reversal of Fortune premiered at the Telluride Film Festival. It was at TIFF as well. It was kind of a festival darling in the fall, and it opened in limited release on October 19th, 1990, expanded in November, prime award season territory. And when it expanded in November, it came in at number 5 that weekend at the box office. And to give you a glimpse into the films of 1990 in November, we had Sibling Rivalry in 4th, Ghost in 3rd, in its 18th week, by the way. Just a total juggernaut. 2nd was Jacob's Ladder, and the number 1 movie in America that weekend, Child's Play 2.
Not
So,
Chucky.
yep. So, a lot to do with death going on at the box office that weekend, I must say. So, interesting. But Reversal of Fortune ultimately made about $15 million at the domestic box office. A decent art house hit, but not really fatal attraction numbers by any means. And then it got mostly positive reviews from critics. Lots of praise for Jeremy Irons' performance and Glenn's performance in the script. It was a pretty good player at that award season, especially for Jeremy Irons and for Nicholas Kazan's script. The two of them all won at the Los Angeles Film Critics Awards and the Boston Film Critics Awards. Jeremy won with the National Society of Film Critics. He won Chicago. He was a runner-up at New York. The film was a great success at the Globes, winning for Jeremy, nominated for Best Picture, Best Screenplay, and Best Director. And then it got 3 nominations at the Oscars. So Best Actor for Jeremy, Best Director, and Best Adapted Screenplay. And Jeremy ended up winning the Oscar, as we mentioned earlier. So do you have any thoughts on why you think Reversal of Fortune did as well as it did with critics and awards that year, and why was Glenn not a part of it?
Yeah, that's interesting. I have a feeling that we were coming off of the 80s, right? Where everything felt kind of bombastic and obvious,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so here you have this film that requires you as a viewer to do some work. Like they
Yep.
don't hand feed you information. The end is pretty dark and ambiguous, and
Right.
you have to make decisions about who these people are the whole way through. I would imagine at that time it wasn't an obvious watch, and it was challenging in a way that cinema at that time really wasn't, to be perfectly honest. And so I imagine that for critics and for audiences in 1990, that for them they were like, ooh, this is probably the beginning of, this is going to usher in this next decade of film.
Mm-hmm.
I would imagine that's probably a big part of it.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I think also just the story itself was so high profile at the time and so juicy, I would imagine, that I don't think there was even really that much pushback from what I could tell about how it was portrayed. And it's just sort of thought to be a very smart, sophisticated film. But I also think the main driver, to be honest, was Jeremy Irons, who was, coming off Dead Ringers the year before. He was reaching true stardom around this time. And I think that was kind of the draw of like seeing this very chilling, enigmatic sort of performance that just draws you in while also repulsing you at the same time. Shares a bit of DNA with the next Best Actor winner, Anthony Hopkins, in The Silence of the Lambs in that way. So that's an interesting parallel. But yeah, I think the main issue for Glenn, though, is maybe some category confusion, perhaps. Because she starts and ends the film. She is in a decent amount of it, but it does definitely feel more like a supporting performance at the same time.
Do you know how
And
they campaigned her?
I spent so much time trying to find that out, but I could not find anything. But
Hmm.
I did do a little bit of research on my trusted newspapers.com, a great archive, looking back to see what people were sort of predicting at that time. And it really does sort of paint the picture well of perhaps what happened, because a lot of people, a lot of predictors were saying she was either a long shot or even a likely nominee for Best Supporting Actress. But then there were a few other columnists who were being like, Best Actress, so it was very unclear for voters, I think, maybe. So yeah, I wish I could find that info, but the most of them were saying supporting, so I would guess that's where they campaigned her. But it does like make me wonder, because she is first billed and contractual stuff. I don't know if that weighs into any of this. So
I don't know that what I'm about to say matters all that much, because there are always outliers, and we've seen plenty of supporting performances win that have had much thinner story arcs than Sunny's in Reversal. But I'm surprised if they had campaigned her solely in the supporting actress category. I'm surprised that she didn't make it in when Jeremy did, because the
yeah.
reality is like both performances are pretty subtle. And if anything, at least with Glenn's scenes, she's giving us a little more shades. Like we're seeing more levels from her,
Hmm.
certainly than we do with Jeremy. But I think so much of his performance, in my opinion, is anchored in hers, right? Because as I pointed out, I think for me, some of his best work are in his scenes with her. So it's surprising that, they weren't both able to ride the wave, especially considering that the film was also nominated for screenplay and for directing. It's
Right.
very odd that she didn't make it in.
And there were some columnists being like, wow, Reversal of Fortune did not make it into Best Picture. This is kind of a surprise, but Ghost did. That was kind of like the narrative going on, is that Ghost kind of surprised in Best Picture, whereas these more
I gotta say though,
sophisticated films.
I think that the interesting thing about this movie though, and this goes back to that question of what we were saying around like why it would have sort of been so beloved in 1990 is it was really also ahead of its time. Like we see true crime narratives all over the place. Like they're pretty omnipresent at this moment. But at that time,
Yeah.
that really wasn't what we were seeing captured in cinema. So the reality is like it was a true story and it was very like ripped from the headlines and it was pretty recent. It wasn't like that much time had sort of elapsed between what happened and then them making this film. And so all that to say that I would imagine that that also made it like interesting and juicy for
Yeah.
people.
Fresh. Yeah, exactly.
And I'm
Uh,
curious if the film was released today, what those nominations and even what the box office would look like, right? Because the reality is like that's kind of what everybody wants today. I don't think that folks were really looking for true crime at the time. So that's what
yeah.
made it feel fresh and unique. But right now, that's everywhere. So if this was released today, I'm sure it's going to be in its 18th week in the same way that Ghost was.
I think I would just argue it would not be made as a movie today. It would be made as a series, as it is now.
Which it will be.
Yeah. So,
Um,
yeah, that's just like, that's just is the trend at the moment. But
yeah, that's fair.
yeah. Would you nominate Glenn in supporting, and who would you take out since you forced me to take someone out?
Oof, can you remind me who was nominated that year?
Yes. Well, it's a great year. The winner was Whoopi Goldberg for Ghost. Unimpeachable performance. We had Annette Bening in The Grifters. We had Lorraine Bracco in Goodfellas. We had Diane Ladd in Wild at Heart, an incredible nomination. And we had Mary McDonnell in Dances with Wolves.
Okay. I very recently rewatched The Grifters, a conversation for another time, but I
Okay.
wouldn't take Annette's nomination away. Yeah, I think the only film in this lineup that I don't have a I shouldn't say I don't have a relationship to. I haven't seen it in ages is Dances with Wolves.
Yeah.
So this feels a little arbitrary, but like I suppose it would be Mary McDonnell only because it's like I haven't seen it in such a long time and I don't it's not like it didn't linger for me in a way that I feel like I need to keep her there. So maybe hers.
Yeah. I think we're in agreement there. Also, though, worth noting, Shirley MacLaine was also robbed of a nomination for Postcards from the Edge. Let's just,
Brilliant performance.
yes.
I think in a lot of people's minds she was nominated for that. I feel like I've talked to folks where they're like, and then there was that performance. Like actually she wasn't
Well,
nominated.
actually, it stopped at Terms of Endearment, believe it or not.
She's
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. So that's tough. I don't know. Do I take out Lorraine Bracco? That I don't know if I want to do that, but it's tough. I'm keeping Diane Ladd. Just that is like cemented in ink for me. And Whoopi, of course. Annette or Lorraine would be my next cut, perhaps, but I
I
don't
think
know.
just because we know what subsequent nominations are coming, I probably in that case to
Mm,
fit. Let me just say this.
okay.
I for sure. hmm,
Uh
well,
oh.
complicated. It's bad when you start pulling threads.
Yes, here we are. Always get
Right.
to those alternate history,
But I
Yeah.
probably would take Annette's nomination away, if I'm being honest, just because she has other nominations coming.
Yeah. Yeah. And she's a leading lady star. So, yeah, she has those nominations. So yeah, I think even though I love her, like if we got Whoopi Goldberg, Diane Ladd, Lorraine Bracco, Shirley MacLaine, and Glenn Close. That's an all-timer category, just saying.
Okay, wait. One more really big question. If you have a choice to only let one of them in, though, is it Shirley or
Oh
Glenn?
no. I knew this was coming because I thought about this as well. Here's the thing. This is a Glenn Close podcast, so this is a difficult thing for me to admit, but I do think Shirley would make my lineup before Glenn. Because that Shirley performance is an all-timer for me. I'm sorry.
Iconic.
Yeah,
Iconic.
so
Like at least once a week, I think about it twirled up.
it
Like it's so
twirled up.
good.
Yes. I mean, speaking of like vocal choices, Shirley MacLaine. Yeah. So anyway, let's get to our final segment where we're going to rate Glenn's performance on a very specific scale for my demented mind. Thinking about her performance and where this sits on her career, would you say that her performance as Sunny von Bülow is such that she is ready for her close-up? One of her best performances. Is it low Glenergy, not one of your favorites, or somewhere in the middle, close but no cigar?
This performance, oh, that's challenging because I had an answer coming in,
Oh boy. Okay.
and now in the course of our conversation, now I'm like,
Hmm.
I'm gonna say ready for her close up. I came
Wow.
into this feeling like close but no cigar, if I'm being
Mm-hmm.
honest.
Okay.
Um, but I think that I had to divorce myself from Glenn being Glenn, right?
Mm-hmm.
She is an icon. She's one of the very few people who have had incredible longevity in their career. Like she's still someone we're talking about. She's still someone who is putting in great work. And as we've noted, in spite of the fact that she is top billing, this really is a supporting performance. And this category was supporting actor or actress as a category in award shows was constructed for those folks who come on and sometimes they're only in one scene. They're only in the film for, 8 or 9 minutes, but they knock it out of the park. And I think that for me, as I said at the start of this, this is a really great example. This is very indicative of on display showing all the things that Glenn is really great at without calling too much attention to itself. And so I think for those reasons, I would say, again, I think it's one of her best. I think if someone is sort of questioning how they feel about her as a performer, I'd say that's a film to watch. Like don't go to, 101 Dalmatians or Dangerous Liaisons or, Fatal Attraction. Like visit this film where she has to do a lot with very little. Where there isn't a lot of connective tissue scene to scene, and there isn't a ton on the page, and look at how she still crafts a character.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, you really just took the words right out of my mouth. This is a ready for her close up moment for me. It is lower tier a little bit than others like a Dangerous Liaisons, but is still in that top tier for me. I think she's so in control of what she's doing. She makes an impression. Her narration is so precise. And I do find it to be very effective work that really lingers with me. It's a very haunting performance, I find. And I do wish more people would put respect on this performance from her. I know Jeremy Irons got all the glory, but Glenn is his equal. She really is. And so I hope people seek this out if they haven't already. But Steven, thank you so much for joining me. I always have such a great time analyzing film with you. And this was a real treat. You were so locked in. It was so fun. So thank you.
Great. Thank you for having me again.
Yeah. Well, where could people find more of your work out in the world and on the internet?
Well, I'm on all well, I'm not on all social platforms. That is a lie. I'm on Blue Sky, the app formerly known as Twitter,
Hmm.
and on Instagram at Steven Canals. And yeah, as you've noted at the beginning, I most recently directed an episode of Dr. Odyssey for ABC, and that episode is currently streaming on Hulu.
Yes. And as I always recommend to people, please watch Pose. And if you
Yes,
have
it's also on Hulu.
yes, and if you have watched Posed, watch it again. It's a great show. Thank you all so much for listening. You could find me at Kevin_Jacobsen on Twitter, Instagram, just Kevin Jacobsen, no underscore on Blue Sky. You can also listen to my Oscar-themed podcast, And the Runner-Up Is, for coverage of every single Best Actress race. Highly recommend listening to the 2010 episode, personally, with me and Steven here.
So fun.
I mean, speaking of like an all-timer category, that's one of the best. But that's And the Runner-Up Is on all platforms. And to keep up with the world according to Glenn on social, go to The Glenn Pod and rate, review, and follow the world according to Glenn on all podcast platforms. And with that, I'll bid you all adieu.